All right. Well, hello. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me. I'm delighted to speak with you guys today about pediatric anesthesia without nitrous oxide. This is really an evolution from dogma that was founded on basic science, but I believe deserves some reconsidering as we've evolved our methods of anesthesia. So I'll start with just a very brief history about laughing gas or nitrous oxide. So nitrous oxide, has a long history with anesthesia, dating back to the 1800s, before it was used for anesthesia when it was a party drug. That concern has actually come back around recently with people buying nitrous oxide that's ostensibly labeled, but never truly intended for culinary use as a propellant. They're called whippets in the United States. And there's reports of addiction, nerve damage, and occasionally death that are actually becoming really common in the United States. But I digress. We're talking about pediatric anesthesia and the legitimate use or non-use of nitrous oxide. So the history of pediatric anesthesia using nitrous oxide really seems to hold on, even though we're talking about reducing our use of nitrous in lots of places. Everyone seems to want to carve out a little niche for pediatric anesthesia. They say, well, but they can't possibly go without it. So there's just this perceived need for an exception for us, and that's what we're going to talk about. So I'll start with a little bit of history. So pediatric anesthesia has long used nitrous oxide along with halothane, right? Halothane was created in the early 1950s. It was approved in the mid-1950s, and it was used worldwide until at least the late 1980s. And it continues to be used, although more and more rarely in the developing world, but there's very few drug companies that are still making it, so it's getting to be more and more rare. Now, halothane really broadened the availability of anesthesia in a lot of places due to one of its primary attributes, which is that it was not flammable, which is much better than the things that preceded it. That was important. It also broadened pediatric anesthesia because it had a more pleasant smell than other things that came before it, also helpful. However, the 1950s were a long time ago, for everyone in the room who's not aware, right? Here's a few other things that were newly popular in the mid-1950s. These include the Wimpy burger chain, popular still in London, James Dean and Rebel Without a Cause, and Bill Haley and the Comets Rockin'. So if halothane was hip or swell or maybe even the bee's knees, it did have some significant drawbacks. And we're going to focus on two that were really ameliorated by nitrous and cemented our use of nitrous with halothane. So drawback for halothane number one is its narrow therapeutic window. And for people in the room who've never used halothane, I'll explain a few things for you. So this narrow therapeutic window is being illustrated here by the Royal Gorge Bridge in my home state of Colorado. This bridge is 290 meters above the Arkansas River. And it actually was the highest bridge in the world from 1929 until 2001, and it's still the highest bridge in the United States. Walking across this footbridge, which is just over 2 meters wide, made of wood planks, is terrifying. As is the prospect, I think, of anesthetizing a child, especially a neonate with high concentration halothane. Halothane is well known to depress the myocardium, and even more so in the neonate. That leads to arrhythmias, bradycardia, and eventually asystole if you're not paying attention. Using nitrous as the carrier for the halothane allowed you to achieve a somewhat higher MAC with less halothane, so it afforded you an important margin of safety if you're trying to avoid doing chest compressions on the baby. This is important. All right, drawback number two of halothane is its very high blood solubility relative to other agents, which of course we know means it has slow uptake into the brain, which causes a prolonged induction phase. Now, I've not personally experienced the speed of Belgium's native red slug, pictured here, but I'm going to assume it's pretty slow, like every other slug I've seen. So if you want to co-administer halothane with nitrous, you do get the benefit of some faster onset of sedation from the nitrous. You also get faster uptake of the halothane via the second gas effect. So that's maybe like giving this slug some wings, so we can move it along faster with some nitrous. All right. However, Like I said, we don't use halothane almost anywhere anymore, and we haven't for many years. Mask induction is done with sevoflurane, which has a much wider therapeutic window, so high concentrations are better tolerated. It's much less soluble, so its onset is faster. So any acceleration of induction that's afforded by the second gas effect with nitrous is really not clinically obvious. So it's really time for our mask induction habits to catch up with these desirable traits of the agent that we actually use now, and to take a critical look at the use of nitrous for mask induction. So we're first going to talk about some clinical drawbacks of nitrous oxide. Number one on my list, probably numbers 1 through about 8 on my list, is that it prevents pre-oxygenation or denitrogenation of the child as we go to sleep. So if we're delivering high concentration nitrous oxide, which is what's necessary if you actually want to get any use of the nitrous oxide, it's got to be at least 50 or 70% of your total gas. That means you're obviously not going to be delivering high concentration oxygen, so you're on something close to room air, so 30, maybe 50%. Now, to belabor the physiology for just a moment, for people who don't specialize in pediatrics or it's been a minute, children have a higher metabolic oxygen demand per kilogram than adults do. They're going to burn through their oxygen faster. They also have less functional residual capacity, right? They're more likely than adults to show up for elective surgery or emergency surgery with snot and respiratory tract infections, so they're more prone to airway complications as it is. And since they're having a mask induction, by definition, they don't yet have intravenous access that you would use to rescue them quickly from said airway complication. Would anybody in this room electively put an adult to sleep breathing room air or 30% oxygen? No, we would never, ever, ever do that. That is a bad idea. So why do we think that in a child, when we have higher oxygen demand, less FRC, no IV access, and likely a URI that can cause an airway complication, why would we think that we would sacrifice our safety net for nitrous? So, numbers are, like I said, 1 through about 8 on my list. High concentration nitrous prevents pre-oxygenation. Number 2 on this list, at least, is that we have to remember that it takes time and a good mask seal to actually allow the euphoria of nitrous to happen. We don't get immediately euphoric breathing nitrous for one breath. It's very difficult to measure euphoria, so you can't objectively say it takes 45 seconds, it takes a minute, it takes a minute and a half. It also depends on your altitude, from what we've learned in Colorado. Either way, it takes at least 45 seconds of a good mask seal in a cooperative patient or child to get the nitrous to actually work. We can talk about how impatient anesthesiologists are when we have time. Next, we need to remember that nitrous doesn't, at least clinically, speed up mask induction. Also a hard thing to measure. There's very few subjective, I keep saying that wrong, objective endpoints of a mask induction. When are we officially induced? When are we officially in or out of stage 2? When are we ready to put in an IV? When are we ready to intubate? These are all very subjective. However, when we've tried to quantify it in some way, we found that nitrous doesn't actually speed up a mask induction. Lastly, we need to remember that a patient who is afraid to let your hand or the mask near their face is not going to have a good induction experience because you have nitrous running. If you try to approach them and they start screaming, nitrous is not going to fix that because it takes time, like we said. So we need a better option for a patient who's very fearful of us coming near their face. All right, next we're going to talk about, in addition to those clinical drawbacks of nitrous, there's some environmental considerations as well. Now, the first and most often cited environmental detriment discussed about nitrous is its global warming potential, which is a measure, like we heard just on the last lecture, about the potency of a greenhouse gas and its ability to trap heat in the atmosphere. So here's a scale that I like to use of inhaled anesthetics global warming potential over a 100-year time period. Now, in the grand scheme of anesthesia care, you might say, well, 265 or so for nitrous doesn't sound that bad. It's pretty close to sevoflurane and isoflurane. But global warming potential is not the whole story. There's so much more to nitrous oxide, and where better to look for more information about someone you're trying to learn about than their dating profile, right? So I'd like you to read deeper into this profile with me. This says, I'll bring heat to this relationship, and a little of me is never enough. You'll want a lot. I'm in it for the long term. I always stay true to myself, even when it strains relationships around me, and my exuberance for life can't be contained. What do you say we meet behind the mask? So although painted as attractively as I could possibly make nitrous oxide, the reality is that nitrous is a potent greenhouse gas, but it's a very weak anesthetic that requires high concentrations for an effect. It persists in the atmosphere for 120 years, and it lyses ozone. In fact, it's actually the dominant ozone-depleting substance in the atmosphere now. And to boot, we have a large nitrous oxide leak problem. So we've talked about clinical reasons that nitrous has some detriments. We've talked now about some environmental reasons that nitrous has some detriments. So all of this taken together leaves me with no love for nitrous oxide for pediatric anesthesia. But what about the kids, right? Tug our heartstrings. We all want kids to have a non-traumatic experience when it comes to anesthesia induction. Fear not. Evidence-based practice has come to the rescue. There are many, many papers that have been written about ways to help children have a good mask induction and an overall good anesthesia experience. Now note that nitrous is not on this list because I couldn't find a single paper that just tried to assess the ability of nitrous to provide a calm mask induction experience. I don't think that paper exists. What is on this list? Things like preoperative tours, distraction, presence of parents, it's a little bit of a plus minus. How about virtual reality? Did I say distraction? How about immersive games? How about pre-medication? How about all kinds of other valid alternatives? And did I say distraction, right? So, due to these significant drawbacks of nitrous, the significant environmental impact, the wide availability of valid evidence-based alternatives, here's my position and my practice. Keep calm and induce without nitrous. So that's where I started. But I'm not really here to tell you that you should do anesthesia the way that I do anesthesia. Let's talk about the bigger picture. My hospital in Colorado, about 2.5 years ago, we embarked on a quality improvement project to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, which of course by definition had to involve our use of nitrous and how much nitrous we were using. So my hospital system does about 35,000 pediatric anesthetics a year between one main campus and 2 ambulatory surgery centers. We have about 40 anesthesiologists and 40 mid-level anesthetists. We also have trainees, fellows, and rotating residents. So we have lots of people, and not necessarily people that stay with us all the time for the educational component. At baseline for this project, we use nitrous for about half of our cases, and almost entirely just for induction. We'll talk about maintenance phase in a moment, but this is almost entirely just for mask induction. So since that time, this is our timeline coming all the way through, we've reduced our nitrous usage really considerably. This has been due to a lot of education, a lot of socialization of the idea, and most importantly, data feedback to everyone in our group about how much nitrous we're using, how much nitrous everyone else is using, and who are the outliers. So nitrous for mask induction is pretty rare now, and our patients are still having a good experience. Nobody asks them, how was your induction of anesthesia experience? We don't have great data. We have kind of surrogate data, which is, how was your overall surgery experience today? That could be anything from like, I had to wait 2 hours, to all the staff were amazing, everything in between. So there's no signal there when we stopped our nitrous usage. I wouldn't really expect there to be. So the sky has not fallen since we quit using nitrous for our mask induction, but the dogma about nitrous for induction of anesthesia definitely has fallen. Now just a brief slide about nitrous for maintenance of anesthesia. This was pretty uncommon at my hospital, and I don't have direct data. So again, using a little bit of surrogate data, I filtered our cases for all of our surgical cases for ones that use greater than 50 liters of nitrous oxide. I figured if we were only using nitrous for induction, we probably were using less than 50. At least I hope so. So cases that were left over that were using greater than 50, I figured were probably people who were using it for maintenance. So at baseline, it was almost 2% of our cases, and now down to 0.2%. So like I said, it wasn't commonly used for maintenance, and now it's even less so. So it's clearly not essential for maintenance of anesthesia either. I think that these last few cases that are showing that 0.2% are probably some of our very sick and tenuous infants who are on inhaled nitric oxide for pulmonary hypertension. It requires high flows to deliver, and they're often quite ill, and they have to run some nitrous to get an anesthetic without the hemodynamic effects. So a very, very, very tiny population. So as far as maintenance of anesthesia in Belgium, I wanted to cite a study that was recently published by De Vos and Swinnen. In Belgium, they did a larger survey of sustainability, but it included some questions just for the anesthesiologists. There were about 120 respondents, and they asked what agents they use for maintenance of anesthesia. Clearly, this was a select-all option because the numbers don't add up to 100, but about 12% of respondents said they used nitrous for maintenance. So, with many of the, with many alternatives to nitrous that we can use to get synergy and good MAC value, we can use with our sevoflurane, I think we could easily target this 12% for greenhouse gas emissions reductions without affecting patient care. All right, I wanted to revisit the topic of nitrous oxide leak. This is a graph showing the clinical use of nitrous at my hospital at the baseline start of our project 2.5 years ago, up to just about a year ago. The blue lines here are how much nitrous we're clinically administering to our patients. This is pulled from anesthesia records, so I know how much I'm actually giving. The problem is, although we have drastically reduced the amount that we're giving, the blue lines are getting tiny as we get further into the project. This is the nitrous that the hospital is purchasing, and anesthesia is the only users of nitrous oxide at my hospital. This is horrifying. Unfortunately, what's more horrifying is that my hospital is not an outlier. Everywhere we look, we find the nitrous oxide pipeline does this. This is really frightening. At my hospital, just before we decommissioned our system, this represented a 98% leak of nitrous oxide at our hospital. So why does this happen? Briefly, this is some pictures from my hospital. This is the anatomy, the inner anatomy of the nitrous pipeline for people who like to geek out about this stuff. Nitrous pipelines are usually fueled by either nitrous. Can you hear me? Yes? Nitrous pipelines are usually fueled either by dewars or cryogenic tanks. Those are the silver ones in the upper left corner, or by H or G cylinders, which are the ones that are about 5.5 feet tall and about, 30 centimeters in diameter. Those are G or H cylinders. Those are hooked up in series or in parallel to a manifold and then to a long set of pipes that that travel all through the hospital to get to the operating suites and in the nitrous wall outlets. Leaks happen at every single juncture, connection point of this system. They also, there's a significant leak that come from the cryogenic tanks because they have a pressure release valve. They hold so much nitrous, which boils at sub-room temperature, so they build up pressure, and if you don't release that pressure, they would explode. So they have to off-gas constantly, and when you don't use much nitrous, your leak gets worse because they have to off-gas even more. However, hospitals that don't use cryogenic tanks, that use the H cylinders, they still have just as big of a leak as the ones that use the dewars. So every hospital that looks at this finds this leak. So the way to mitigate this is to stop using the central pipeline altogether and use nitrous. If you're going to use it at the site of clinical care. That means a portable tank or an E cylinder, usually mounted to the back of an anesthesia machine. Now, trying to sell that to people who use a lot of nitrous might be a little hard, but in our hospital, we did it the other way around. We reduced our use of nitrous a lot, which then justified turning the pipeline to deactivation status and using the e-cylinders on the back of our tank. So when I approached our administration about doing this, I said, this is how much nitrous we're actually using now, and this is how many e-cylinders I expect to need per year per anesthesia location. So this is not onerous. The high bar there at 7 is all 7 of our radiology locations combined. So this doesn't really count as 7, it counts as 7 ones, maybe. Our next busiest room would be expected to use about 4 e-cylinders per year. So this is not a big deal. Our anesthesia techs are not running around changing tanks like crazy. We don't need a massive storage room, etc. I wish I could just convince people we don't need nitrous at all, but when that's not mandated by the government, like I learned about in Germany recently, or other things, you have to motivate individual people, and having a tank on the back helps to facilitate this. So this is not an onerous thing to do, especially if you can reduce your usage first. So I want to conclude with some words from some of our Belgian colleagues in an editorial in 2021. Michelle Kerala and Gregory Hans said, considering that small adjustments in daily routines can have a massive impact on the ecological footprint, a first important step in this should be evidence-based education of anesthesiologists and trainees on the ecological impact of different aspects of anesthesia management. So I hope I've provided you with this first important step as regards nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide is a useful drug, and sometimes maybe we do need it in very limited circumstances. We used it to afford a margin of safety for our patients when we used halothane, a much more dangerous inhaled anesthetic, but with modern agents, we really don't need it. And the detriments have become worthy of consideration given that we have many evidence-based alternatives that can help children have a smooth induction experience. I fully agree with Drs. Carell and Hans that also, in their definition of the ideal anesthetic, which includes fast and predictable onset with high therapeutic margin and clearance resulting in low toxicity and short duration of action, to these traditional pharmacological properties, it appears more sensible than ever to add the environmental clearance. More generally speaking, the footprint of our practice should be as short-lasting as possible for the well-being of next generations. It's time that our practice be updated to reflect the modern tools that we have at our disposal. Nitrous oxide is by far the inhaled agent with the longest atmospheric lifetime of all the inhaled agents. And its environmental impact is significant, so I hope I've given you some reasons to reconsider its use in your practice. Not only is mask induction without nitrous really well tolerated, it increases safety by increasing your fraction of inspired oxygen during mask induction, and giving you time to manage an airway that you didn't expect to need more time. I've told many of my trainees, and I would tell you, if it's your own child, what would you prefer? If they're going to have an airway issue, which everybody hopes that doesn't happen, but if it's your child, would you rather that they be breathing 30% oxygen or 100% when that happens? And for me, that's a pretty easy choice. So shifting the culture of a hospital, even a pediatric hospital, away from using nitrous oxide is feasible. It's very rewarding. So I'd invite you to consider your own practice first, and then look into making bigger changes within your hospital, like deactivating the central nitrous pipeline. That's going to lead to a drastic reduction in environmental impact of your anesthesia care. And lastly, as leaders in this perioperative arena and space, we're well positioned to bring about changes to our practice. Reassessing and adapting from the idea that we've always done it this way really helps to assure that we're providing the best care for our patients and for the world that they'll inherit from us. Thank you.
Questions from the audience?